Number 1.
Dorothy Jane Scott was born April 23, 1948, to Jacob and Vera Scott in Anaheim, California. In 1966, when Dorothy was 18, young women across the United States, many of them living in California, were breaking social norms, fighting for equal rights and becoming increasingly liberated. The revolutionary lifestyle, however, did not suit Dorothy, who was an introvert above all else. In 1976, Dorothy gave birth to a son, Sean. As far as I can tell, Sean's father was not in the picture for long after he was born, if at all, and lived nearly 2,000 miles away in Missouri at the time in question. Dorothy and Sean lived about 20 minutes from Anaheim in Stanton, California with Dorothy's aunt. While close with her family, Dorothy was very self-reliant. She worked backroom secretary jobs at 2 jointly owned stores in Anaheim, Swingers Psych Shop, selling love beads, incense, lava lamps. It had a real Woodstock vibe by the sounds of it, and Custom John's Head Shop. Jacob and Vera Scott lived close to Dorothy's workplaces, meaning Dorothy could leave Sean with them while she worked. Jacob was also a co-owner of Swingers. At work, Dorothy was known by her co-workers as dependable and organized. Her friends and family described her as a great mom, a caring friend and deeply committed to her Christian faith. She did not do drugs or go out drinking, preferring to stay at home spending time with her son and going to church. There was nothing extraordinary about May 28, 1980. Dorothy dropped Sean off at her parents' home and went to work as usual. There was a staff meeting at Swingers that evening at 9 p.m., so Dorothy told her parents she would be late picking up Sean. During the staff meeting, one of Dorothy's co-workers, Conrad Bostron, began to look a little off. There was a red swelling on his arm that clearly needed medical attention, so Dorothy and another colleague, Pam Head, left the meeting early to take Conrad to the hospital. There were no cell phones in those days, so Dorothy decided to stop by her parents' home briefly to tell them she was taking Conrad to the hospital and did not know when exactly she would be back to pick up Sean. Dorothy emerged from the house, having changed the scarf she was wearing from a black one to a red one. The three then drove to UC Irvine Medical Center. Dorothy and Pam sat in the waiting room while Conrad was treated for what turned out to be a spider bite. Pam would later tell investigators that she and Dorothy had been together the whole time that Conrad was with the doctor. Conrad was treated and given a prescription, which he and Pam went to have filled. This was around 11 p.m. Dorothy went to the bathroom, then told the other two she would go get the car and pull up in front of the hospital so Conrad wouldn't have to walk too far. This would be the last time anyone would ever see Dorothy alive. Having picked up the medication, Conrad and Pam went to wait for Dorothy at the hospital entrance. It was about 20 minutes before they saw Dorothy's car, a white 1973 Toyota station wagon, coming towards them. The headlights were blindingly bright, and the car did not look as though it was going to stop for them. It ended up speeding past them so quickly they had no time to even try and glimpse who was driving. Confused and concerned by what had happened, Pam and Conrad stayed at the hospital for several hours, waiting to see if Dorothy might return for them. She never did. They called her parents from the phone in the hospital, asking if she had ever come home to pick up Sean, to which they replied she had not. Unsure of what else to do, Pam and Conrad called the police to report Dorothy missing. Given that she was an adult, they did not seem overly concerned. At 4:30 a.m. on May 29th, about 5 hours since Dorothy was last seen, her car was discovered in Santa Ana, about 10 miles from the UC Irvine Medical Center. Whoever kidnapped Dorothy had driven the car to an alleyway, set fire to it and left. If the police were not concerned before, this finding changed that. Several months before her disappearance, Dorothy began receiving menacing phone calls from an unknown man. While she recognized the voice, it was likely an acquaintance with whom she had only exchanged a few words. What the man spoke about on the phone differed from call to call. Sometimes he would tell Dorothy how much loved her and wanted to be with her. Other calls he told her he wanted to kill her. Most chilling was that his obsession with Dorothy went beyond harassing her on the phone. He took it a step further, describing to her details about herself that only someone who was following her would know, for example, her daily routine and what she was wearing. Vera, Dorothy's mother, described one call in particular that really terrified her daughter, in which the unknown caller told her he wanted to chop her up into bits so no one would ever find her. The calls justifiably rattled Dorothy. She no longer felt safe at home or at work, knowing there was a dangerous and unhinged person tracking her every move. Just a week before her disappearance, she began taking karate lessons. She also considered buying a gun. The phone calls from Dorothy's stalker did not stop after she disappeared. The first call was made to Jacob and Vera's home about a week after Dorothy disappeared. Vera was home alone. "Are you related to Dorothy, Scott?" the caller asked. "Yes," Vera replied. "I've got her," the caller said, then hung up. The authorities had been searching for Dorothy, but so far nothing had brought them any closer to finding out what happened. The phone call was the first clue they got in the case, but pursuing it ultimately proved fruitless. Vera and Jacob were told not to go to the media about Dorothy's disappearance, as it could negatively impact the investigation. However, after a week of searching and no progress being made, Jacob gave up waiting and called the Orange County Register about his daughter's disappearance. The paper ran a story about Dorothy and the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. Clearly keeping a close eye on the news regarding Dorothy's disappearance, the unknown caller got on the phone with the editor of the newspaper, Pat Riley, and said to him, "I killed her. I killed Dorothy Scott. She was my love. I caught her cheating with another man. She denied having someone else. I killed her." The caller also detailed certain pieces of information that only someone who was involved in her disappearance would know, for example, that she was wearing a red scarf the evening she disappeared, and that the man she was with that night, Conrad, was being treated for a spider bite. The phone call to Pat Riley baffled Dorothy's family and friends. They told authorities they had no knowledge of Dorothy having a boyfriend, let alone time for one, with her 2 jobs and her son to look after. Dorothy's abductor was clearly living in a fantasy world. Months went by, eventually turning into years. During this time, the unknown man ever tired of taunting Vera. Nearly every Wednesday afternoon for 4 years, he would call the Scott home, saying he had Dorothy, and he had killed her, or something along those lines. He knew Vera and Jacob's routine, and only called when Vera was home alone. One time, he slipped up and called in the evening, only to find Jacob on the other end. This brought an end to the calls, for a while, anyway. Police tried tracing his calls, but he never stayed on the line long enough. The case went cold. No one was ever officially named a suspect in the case, and there have never been any arrests. Dennis Terry, the father of Sean, was looked into, but was ruled out as a suspect, given he was in Missouri at the time of Dorothy's disappearance. I don't want to point fingers here, but this name popped up enough times in my research that I thought it was worth mentioning. The name of the man, Mike Butler, has come up thanks to sleuthing by internet detectives. Butler apparently worked as a mechanic next door or across the street from Swingers, where his sister also worked with Dorothy. Internet sleuths point to this idea that he held alternative religious beliefs, possibly he was involved with the occult, and was supposedly kind of an oddball. I'd like to reiterate that there is no solid evidence against Mike Butler, nor was he ever considered a suspect. I've read through threads in which people build their case against him by saying he worked close enough to Dorothy to track her routine, and may have dropped by swingers from time to time and talked to her enough that she would recognize his voice in a phone call. On the other hand, people defend Butler, pretty much saying he's being used as a scapegoat due to his different beliefs, and being generally a bit strange. Butler died in 2014. If you're interested in doing some deeper reading into him of your own, please feel free. Honestly, I'm kind of up in the air on this one. While I can definitely understand wanting someone to blame for Dorothy's murder and the terror she endured at the hands of her stalker, I also want to trust that detectives had good reasons not name him a suspect. On August 6, 1984, human bones and dog bones were discovered lying side by side, about 10 meters from Santa Ana Canyon Road in a remote construction site. The dog bones are a bit of a question mark. I couldn't find any information on how old they were. In fact, they did not come up very much at all in my research. Perhaps the dog had been Dorothy's killer's pet, and he intentionally put the remains there when the dog died? Honestly, I can't think of another good reason as to why they would be there, but I do think they were placed there on purpose. Just over a week later, dental records were used to confirm that the remains belonged to Dorothy Scott. A turquoise ring and a wristwatch were also discovered at the scene, which Vera recognized as Dorothy's. The discovery of the remains brought about a sense of relief amongst Dorothy's family and friends, coupled with an overwhelming sadness that she was really gone. On August 22, a memorial service was held to celebrate Dorothy's life. Yet, the sick individual still did not give up harassing Dorothy's family. They received more calls, although I do not know how much longer they went on for. Dorothy and her family never got the justice they deserved. This year marks the 40th anniversary of Dorothy's disappearance, and her case is still very much a cold one.
Number 2.
The 4 teenage girls were brutally murdered on a Friday night at a yogurt shop in North Austin in December 1991. The girls' families and those who worked decades trying to find and prosecute their killers say the 30th anniversary of their murders approaches with no sense of closure. The murders remain unsolved, and experts say the crimes lacking resolution can leave a psychological impact on an entire community. There is a sort of collective empathy, if you will, for the extended victims, family members, the people whose lives were affected by this that can endure for a long, long time, said John Vincent, director of the Center for Forensic Psychology at the University of Houston. But new state and federal efforts, as well as a promising DNA lead, have brought renewed hope for answers and justice. "We are not sitting by and doing nothing," said Angie Ayers, sister-in-law of Amy Ayers, and an advocate for the families of the victims. "We are still working on it almost every single day. People think this is a story. This is our life," Ayers said. "There is no one on this earth that can understand the pain and the brutality and the torture of that, except for these particular families. And I don't wish it on anyone. It has been nothing but hell." The details of the crime, including the subsequent investigation and criminal trials that followed, have been well documented. Jennifer Harbison and Eliza Thomas, both 17, worked at the I Can't Believe It's Yogurt on West Anderson Lane. Jennifer's sister Sarah Harbison, 15, and Amy Ayers, 13, arrived at the yogurt shop around closing time on December 6, 1991, with plans to attend a sleepover together. Amy was an 8th grader at Burnett Middle School. The other girls attended Lanier High School. They were shot in the head and gagged with their own clothes. Their bodies were stacked on top of one another before being set on fire. Authorities arrested 4 suspects in October 1999, 8 years after the crime. Only 2, Robert Burns Springsteen IV and Michael James Scott, stood trial, and both were convicted. Springsteen received the death penalty, and Scott got life in prison. But the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturned their convictions, ruling that their confessions were improperly used against each other in their respective trials. Springsteen and Scott were released from prison, and prosecutors dismissed all charges against them. In 2017, another potential breakthrough emerged. An Austin detective submitted DNA evidence found in one of the victims into a database that searches YSTR DNA samples, a type of DNA profile that forensic investigators use to identify male relatives of suspects. A match was found. The Austin Police Department requested more information about the identity of the matching donor. But the FBI has refused to release any information, saying a federal statute prohibits it from disclosing identities of anonymous donors. It is an uphill battle to try to find answers and justice, Ayers said. Despite these hurdles, the families have continued to work to keep the case in the forefront. Their efforts have led to new crime-fighting initiatives at the state and federal levels. When I heard there were over 19,000 unsolved homicides in Texas, I was really taken aback by that, and I think most people are when they hear that number. When you think about each of those cases, there's a family associated with that, said Mindy Montford, who was the first assistant district attorney for Travis County and one of the prosecutors assigned to the yogurt shop murder case for 4 years. In 2018, Montford met with a prosecutorial team from California that helped solve a 42-year-old cold case, leading to the arrest of Joseph James D'Angelo Jr., also known as the Golden State Killer. The California folks at that meeting started bringing our attention to a lot of things that we didn't even know were out there in different labs, different genealogists, and just from around the country, Montford said. I was just thinking about why there wouldn't be some sort of statewide unit that would kind of be a resource to all these local agencies and stay on top of technology and be able to fund DNA and just to connect these agencies to resources that they may not know exist. The yogurt shop murders led Montford to work with Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton to form the state cold case and Missing Persons Unit on October 19th. The unit will aid and support law enforcement agencies across the state in the investigation and prosecution of unsolved cases, including homicides, missing persons, and other matters centered around human identification and forensic genealogy, the Attorney General's office said in announcing the unit. Montford serves as senior counsel for the unit. Angie and Sean Ayers, the brother of the youngest victim, sit on its advisory committee. I think success of this unit is really defined more by the fact that we are not forgetting these cases, that we are actually going to give it the attention it needs, Montford said. We are going to review it as thoroughly as we can. Ayers and the families have also been pushing to effect change on a national level. In May 2021, U.S. Representatives Michael McCaul, a Texas Republican, and Eric Swalwell, a California Democrat, reintroduced the Bipartisan Homicide Victims' Families' Rights Act. If a case has been cold for 3 years, it gives the victims the right to petition the local district attorney to re-examine the cold case and take another look at it, McCaul said last week in an interview. It's very much empowering to the families of the victims, and particularly the case like the yogurt shop killings. McCaul consulted with the Ayers on the legislation. Angie is the biggest advocate for this bill, McCaul said. I applaud her for getting involved. Evil walking the streets. Many remember the yogurt shop murders as a defining moment in Austin, which was about half its current size, and not yet a tech and tourist hub. I remember how shocking and how horrible and horrific that was. We really were a small town, and that kind of thing just doesn't belong in a small town like Austin, said Mayor Steve Adler, who was practicing law in Austin at the time. I think that it was the beginning of a kind of coming of age, recognizing that we were not insulated from the kinds of things that happened to other cities around the world. That was the most random act of violence, said Louis Black, co-founder of the Austin Chronicle and the South by Southwest Festival. When they couldn't solve it, it became uglier and more hideous. Suddenly, people didn't feel safe anymore, and it really changed the nature of the city, Black said. There literally is evil walking the streets, he added. The unsolved nature of a case like this can take a psychological toll on the city's residents, said Randall Osborne, a social psychology professor at Texas State University. One of the ways that we make ourselves feel safer is by defensively attributing bad things to bad people, he said, referring to the social psychological theory of defensive attribution. When a culprit is caught or killed, as in the case of Charles Whitman, the lone shooter who killed 16 people from atop the tower at the University of Texas at Austin in 1966, it is easier for people to compartmentalize the tragedy as an isolated event, because they can say Whitman was a bad person, Osborne said. When you don't have a culprit that you can point to and say, that person did it. That was the danger. It's hard to defend yourself against that future fear, Osborne added. So you're constantly sort of walking around in this state of alert and danger, and that's exhausting. It's not very healthy, and that can really hurt your physical and mental health. The 30th anniversary of the yogurt shop murders brings up painful memories for those who tried to solve the crime. There was a long time to where I would purposely hide, and kind of rolled up into a shell just about every December 6, said Sergeant John Jones, who was the lead Austin Police Department investigator assigned to the case at the time of the murder. If there's no statute of limitations on murder, then there shouldn't be any limitation on doing what one can to try to get it solved, and that sometimes means having to relive that pain and answer questions. My theory is if me talking about it to you, or anybody else, can jog somebody's memory out there to perhaps get this thing solved, then it's worth reliving that night. So as much as I want to put it behind me, I kind of can't, Jones said. The girls' families believe the case will be solved. It's only a matter of time, Ayers said. It is very important that the story is not forgotten, because if the story is forgotten, then you forgot the 4 girls, Ayers said. They were 4 little girls minding their own business, who had a tragic end to their life. And Austin should never forget.
Number 3.
On the evening of November 18, 1987, police found the body of Ruby Elaine Dardeen. She was beaten ferociously. As a result, she had gone into labor, and the killer or killers had also beaten her newborn to death. Everyone suspected that the husband Russell Keith Dardeen did it, but on November 19, the following day, Keith's body was found. He had been shot, and his genitals were mutilated. Further examination revealed that he had been killed within an hour of his family. The Dardeen family murders were considered too brutal to be reported on daytime TV. The Dardeen family consisted of Russell Keith Dardeen, 29, his wife Rudy Elaine Dardeen, 30, 2-year-old son Peter. They were ready to welcome another child, and decided to name it either Ian or Casey, depending on whether it was a boy or a girl. Keith bought a trailer in 1986 after completing the training required for his job as a treatment plant operator. Keith and Elaine rented the land it sat on from a nearby farming couple. Nestled among woodland beside Route 37, just outside the Enid, Illinois, with their 2-year-old. Keith worked at a treatment plant and Elaine worked at an office supply store in Mount Vernon. In their free time, the couple played in the musical ensemble at a local Baptist church. Elaine and Keith considered moving to a better place as they were welcoming their new child. They had put their mobile home up for sale, but it was not the only reason they wanted to move. The Dardeen family did not like staying in the area because it had been becoming increasingly violent, and the couple wanted to move somewhere safer for their children. There had been 15 homicides in Jefferson County in the previous 2 years. As a result, Keith became very protective of his family, and that one night, when a young woman came by his trailer to make a phone call, he refused to let her in. On November 18, 1987, Keith, who had been a reliable worker at the treatment plant, did not show up to work, nor he had informed anyone, and calls to his house went unanswered all day. Keith's supervisor called his parents, but neither of them knew what happened to their son. Keith's parents became concerned and called the sheriff's office and agreed to drive down to Ina with the house key and meet the deputies. No one had a hint of what was inside. Once inside, they met a horrid scene that would mentally scar them for the rest of their lives. They found bodies of Elaine, her 2-year-old son, Peter, and the newborn baby, and all lying in a single bed. Elaine and Peter had been bound and gagged with duct tape. Both of them had been beaten so severely that Elaine, who was pregnant at the time, went into labor and delivered a girl, but the killer or killers took no mercy on the newborn either, and killed the newborn too. They were beaten with a baseball bat. It was a birthday gift from Keith to Peter earlier that year. Elaine suffered a blow on the right top of her head that fractured her skull, and 2-year-old Peter suffered numerous abrasions and contusions. His skull was also fractured. 3 members of the family were slain to death, but Keith was missing along with their car. There was no hint as to where he could have been. Investigators assumed that Keith had killed his family and ran away. A team was assigned to search Keith, but their search was cut short the following day after a group of hunters discovered his body in a wheat field not far from the trailer. Keith had been shot 3 times, on his skull, right side of his face, and on his left cheek. His penis had been also chopped off. Keith's car was found parked outside a police station in Benton, around 11 miles away from his family house. The inside of the trailer was spattered with blood, indicating that Keith had been murdered there. Autopsies of the bodies were not enough to conclude who was killed first. It was determined that they were all killed within an hour or two. As the news of Dardeen family homicides circulated around the area, locals were left even more fearful than they were already. There was a rise in gun sales as well as sales in security systems. Before the incident, the locals left their door unlocked, but now they double-checked to make sure they were locked. A total of 30 detectives worked full-time on the case, interviewing 100 people, but nothing proved to be helpful. Investigators were bound to find the motive behind the murders. Determining the motive behind the murder was difficult in the case. The back door was unlocked. There was no evidence of forced entry, and a VCR and portable camera were in plain sight in the living room. Cash and jewelry were equally accessible in another room. Keith was sexually mutilated. Investigators ruled out sexual motivation. Investigators could not find any extramarital affairs involving either Keith or Elaine, which could have resulted in a jealous rage, nor they could find any grudge or debt troubles. A stack of papers with sports scores found in the house led them to wonder whether Keith has been in gambling debts. However, Joanne Dardeen, Keith's mother, told the police that her son was so frugal that he raised his young son's college fund by reselling 50-cent cans of soda at work for a small profit. Inside Keith's trailer, police found a small amount of marijuana, but never found conclusive evidence that they were a drug dealer. Keith's mother suggested that marijuana has belonged to the killer or killers. Joanne said later that "I think someone wanted Keith to sell drugs, and he refused." Several years later in 1997, she said, "Or there's a possibility someone like Elaine, and she would not accept his advances and he took out his rage on both of them. We just don't know." The murder of the Dardeen family was so brutal that some believed that it had been a work of a cult trying to appease the devil, but no symbols related to a ritual were found in the trailer. However, investigators did not believe that they were randomly chosen. I believe it was a very personal, deliberate thing. As time passed, the case grew colder and colder, but Keith's mother made sure that the authorities don't forget the brutal murder. She continued pressuring the authorities to try solving the murders of her son and his family. She gathered more than 3,000 signatures in an attempt to get the Oprah Winfrey Show to telecast a segment on the murders, but the producers turned her down, saying the crime was too brutal for the daytime television. America's Most Wanted had a similar reaction at the beginning, but they changed their mind in 1998 and telecast a segment. The show, however, was unable to generate any new leads. The most promising lead came in 2000, when serial killer Tommy Lynn Sells was arrested for cutting the throats of Kayleen Harris, 13, and Crystal Searles, 10, near Del Rio, Texas. After his arrest, Tommy claimed that he had carried out the Dardeen killing along with other 70 unsolved murders. Sells was confirmed to have committed at least 22 murders, but the investigators were unable to link him to the Dardeen family murders. He gave statements, but nothing matched the evidence. Sells claimed in 2010 that he met Keith at a truck stop, and while telling the story again he said he met him at a local pool hall. In both versions he said that Keith invited him for dinner and a three-way with him and Elaine. Keith's mother discarded his claims and said Keith was far too protective of his family to do such a thing. When Tommy Sells first confessed to killing the Dardeen family, Joanne was convinced of his guilt, but as Sells was interviewed he was found to be less reliable. When asked how Elaine's body was positioned, he answered that incorrectly, before finally guessing the position correctly. While he answered some details correctly, but those details could have easily picked from the media. Sells said in his 2010 interview, "I know people got their doubts, they say there's no physical evidence tying me to Dardeens, but there wasn't for any of them, because they wasn't looking for me. I moved. I was always a transient." Sells was put to death in 2014, and nobody has ever been charged with the murders of the Dardeen family. We will never know whether Tommy Sells was involved in the murder of the Dardeen family, or he was trying to avoid the death penalty by confessing to crimes he had not committed and take advantage of the judicial system's gratitude. There is a reason why this murder is unsolved for over 3 decades. Whether it was the murder of all family members or no motive was found behind the killing. However, there is no strong theory that gives the motive behind the brutal killing of the Dardeen family. Keith's mother Joanne said that someone wanted him to sell drugs and Keith refused them, and here they may have killed his family. Someone from Elaine's past, her stalker, or someone she refused, had killed their family. Keith's friend told that Keith had become very protective of his family, that once when a girl asked to use their phone he didn't let her in. Maybe that girl has something to do with the murders. However, 3 decades later, the murder of the Dardeen family is still unsolved, and looks like it will remain the same way.